The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of Riverside Avenue, where Marcus Thompson wiped his grease-stained hands on an old shop rag for the 100th time that day. His small auto repair shop, squeezed between a laundromat and a vacant storefront, had seen better days. The paint peeled from its walls like old skin, and the neon sign that once proudly announced Thompson's Auto Repair now flickered weakly, missing half its letters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had inherited the shop from his father 3 years ago, along with a mountain of debt and a reputation for honest work that barely kept the lights on. At 32, he looked older than his years, his face weathered by long hours under car hoods and the constant worry of making ends meet. His calloused hands told the story of countless repairs, each scar a reminder of the struggle to keep his father's dream alive. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Patterson shuffled in to collect her keys. Her ancient Buick had been making a grinding noise for weeks, and Marcus had finally tracked down the problem to a worn brake pad that she couldn't afford to replace properly. Instead, he'd done what he could with used parts and his own labor, charging her just enough to cover materials. "How much do I owe you, dear?" she asked, clutching her worn purse with arthritic fingers. $23, Marcus said gently. Knowing it was less than half what any other shop would charge, she counted out crumpled bills and a handful of coins, apologizing for the small change. "It's all I have until my Social Security comes in next week." Marcus accepted the payment without complaint, adding the coins to the small pile in his cash register. Every penny mattered in his world, where the difference between staying open and closing forever often came down to dollars, not hundreds. After Mrs. Patterson left, Marcus returned to the engine he'd been working on, a 2008 Honda Civic. It belonged to a college student who needed it running by Monday morning for her new job. The radiator needed replacement, but the girl could only afford a used one. Had spent his morning calling every junkyard within 50 miles, was finally locating a decent part for $40 instead of the $200 a new one would cost. As he worked, his mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting on his desk. The electricity company had sent a final notice, and his landlord, Mr. Kowalski, had been increasingly pointed in their conversations about late rent. Marcus had been juggling payments for months, always one step behind, but somehow managing to keep everything from falling apart completely. The heat was becoming unbearable inside the garage, and Marcus stepped outside for air. Across the street, the Riverside Elementary School had just let out, and children in bright backpacks streamed onto the sidewalks. Their laughter and chatter filled the air with an energy that made Marcus smile despite his troubles. He remembered walking those same streets as a boy, stopping by his father's shop every day after school, learning the trade that would eventually become his burden and his salvation. Among the children, one small figure caught his attention. A girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sat alone on the concrete steps of the school building while her classmates dispersed with parents or headed home in groups. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a yellow sundress that had seen better days. Most striking was her stillness while other children moved with the restless energy of youth. She sat perfectly quiet, her small hands folded in her lap. Marcus watched as minutes passed and the crowd of children thinned. Teachers emerged from the building, locked doors, and drove away. The little girl remained on the steps, occasionally checking a small plastic watch on her wrist. Concern began to gnaw at Marcus's chest. Where were her parents? Why was she still waiting? The ice cream truck's familiar melody drifted down the street, growing louder as it approached. Marcus saw the girl's head turn toward the sound, her expression brightening for just a moment before settling back into patient waiting. The truck pulled up to the curb directly in front of the school. The remaining children rushed toward it with excited shouts. The girl stood up and walked to the edge of the group, close enough to see the colorful pictures on the truck's side, but far enough back to make it clear she wasn't in line. Marcus watched her study the images of ice cream bars and popsicles, her small face showing a longing that twisted something deep in his chest. One by one, the other children made their purchases and ran off, leaving the girl standing alone next. To the truck, the ice cream vendor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, noticed her lingering presence. "What can I get for you, sweetheart?" he asked gently. The girl looked up at him with wide brown eyes. "How much for the strawberry one?" she asked, pointing to a picture of a pink popsicle. $2, the vendor replied. She reached into a small pocket of her dress and pulled out a collection of coins. Marcus couldn't see exactly how much she had from his distance, but he watched her count carefully, her lips moving silently as she added up the change. After a moment, her shoulders sagged slightly, and she shook her head. "I don't have enough," she said softly, tucking the coins back into her pocket. The vendor's expression softened. $1.37. She replied with the precision only children possess when counting their precious savings. Marcus felt his feet moving before his mind, had fully processed the decision. He crossed the street with long strides, his hand already reaching into his pocket for the small collection of coins Mrs. Patterson had given him just an hour earlier. "Excuse me?" he called out as he approached the truck. Both the vendor and the little girl turned to look at him. Up close, Marcus could see that despite her neat appearance, the girl's dress had been carefully mended in several places, and her shoes, while clean, were worn thin at the soles. "I'll cover the difference," Marcus said to the vendor, pulling out 63 cents in quarters and dimes. He held the coins out to the girl instead of handing them directly to the vendor. "Here you go, sweetheart. Now you can get that strawberry popsicle." The girl stared at the coins in his outstretched palm, then looked up at his face with an expression of pure amazement. "Really? For me?" "Really," Marcus confirmed, his voice gentler than he'd heard it in months. "Everyone deserves ice cream." On a hot day like this, with careful precision, she took the coins from his hand, added them to the money from her pocket, and handed the full amount to the vendor. The man smiled broadly as he reached into his truck and emerged with the strawberry popsicle she'd been admiring. "Thank you, mister," she said to Marcus, her face glowing with genuine gratitude. She unwrapped the popsicle carefully, as if it were made of something precious rather than ice and sugar. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, crouching down to her eye level. "Sophie," she replied around a small bite of popsicle. "Sophie Mitchell." Marcus, it's nice to meet you, Sophie." He glanced around the now empty school grounds. "Are you waiting for someone to pick you up?" Sophie nodded. "My mom. She works late sometimes, but she always comes." There was absolute confidence in her voice, the kind of unwavering faith that only children possess. Marcus felt a protective instinct he didn't fully understand. "Would you like to wait in my shop? It's got air conditioning, and you can see the street from the window." Sophie considered this carefully. "My mom told me not to go with strangers." "That's very smart advice," Marcus agreed. "How about if you just sit on the bench right outside my shop? That way you're still in the same place your mom expects to find you, but you'll have some shade." This seemed acceptable to Sophie. Followed Marcus across the street to the small wooden bench outside his shop. Bench his father had built years ago for customers waiting for their cars. Marcus disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a bottle of cold water. "In case you get thirsty," he explained, setting it beside her on the bench, as Sophie settled in with her popsicle. Marcus returned to his work on the Honda, but found himself glancing out the window every few minutes to check on her. She sat contentedly, taking small, deliberate bites of her treat, making it last as long as possible. Occasionally she would wave at him through the window and he would wave back, struck by how such a simple interaction could brighten his entire afternoon. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Marcus began to worry again. Where was Sophie's mother? He considered calling the police, but Sophie seemed so certain that her mom would come, and he didn't want to alarm the child unnecessarily. Then, from across the street, he noticed movement. A woman emerged from behind a large oak tree near the school, moving slowly toward them. She was tall and elegant, dressed in expensive-looking clothes that seemed oddly formal for a school pickup. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the quality of her jewelry catching the afternoon light, but there was something strange about her behavior. Instead of walking directly to Sophie, she moved cautiously, staying partially hidden behind parked cars and trees. Marcus watched, puzzled, as the woman positioned herself with a clear view of the bench where Sophie sat, but made no move to approach. Sophie, absorbed in her melting popsicle, seemed unaware of the woman's presence. Marcus found himself in an unusual position, observing what appeared to be a mother watching her own daughter from a distance, as if she were a stranger afraid to intrude. The woman's face, when Marcus caught glimpses of it, carried an expression of profound sadness mixed with something that looked almost like longing. Her expensive clothes and careful grooming couldn't hide the vulnerability in her posture, the way she held herself as if afraid of being seen or rejected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus wiped his hands and stepped outside, ostensibly to check on Sophie, but really to get a better look at this mysterious woman. As he emerged from his shop, the woman quickly stepped back behind a parked SUV, clearly not wanting to be seen.
What?
That popsicle treating you, Sophie? Marcus asked, settling onto the bench beside the little girl. It's the best one I've ever had, Sophie replied with the serious tone children use when expressing something important. Thank you again for helping me buy it. You're very welcome. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. Sophie does. Your mom usually pick you up right at this spot? Sometimes here, sometimes at the school steps? She likes to see me before I see her. Sophie's matter-of-fact tone suggested this was normal behavior, but Marcus found it increasingly strange. She... Does she ever seem nervous about picking you up? Sophie considered this question with the gravity of a child unused to adults asking her opinion about grown-up matters. She gets sad sometimes, and she looks at me like she's trying to remember something important. The pieces began forming a picture in Marcus's mind, though he couldn't yet see the full image. A mother who watches from a distance, a child who speaks of being looked at as if through a memory. Expensive clothes, coupled with carefully mended dresses. None of it quite fit together. From his peripheral vision, Marcus saw the woman move again, this time closer. She had positioned herself behind a mailbox where she could clearly see Sophie, and Marcus noticed she was holding something in her hands, what appeared to be a small wrapped package. The woman behind the mailbox clutched the small wrapped package tighter as she watched her daughter finish the last bite of her strawberry popsicle. Victoria Ashworth had been standing in various hiding spots around Riverside Elementary for 43 minutes, wrestling with the same internal battle that had consumed her for months. Every fiber of her being wanted to run to Sophie, to sweep her into her arms and apologize for all the distance she'd created between them. Yet something stronger held her back, a paralyzing fear that had taken root the day her world collapsed 18 months ago. Marcus pretended to adjust something on his shop's exterior while keeping a careful eye on both Sophie and the mysterious woman. His instincts told him this situation was far more complicated than a simple delayed pickup. The woman's expensive attire contrasted sharply with her daughter's carefully maintained, but obviously second-hand clothing. More telling was her behavior. No. Mother hides from her own child unless something is deeply wrong. Sophie slid off the bench and walked to the small trash can beside Marcus's shop, disposing of her popsicle wrapper with the same careful precision she'd shown in counting her money. When she returned to the bench, she noticed Marcus watching her and offered him a smile that could have powered the flickering neon sign above his shop. My mom should be here soon, she said, settling back onto the bench. She's probably just stuck in traffic. Downtown gets really busy this time of day. Marcus nodded, though he'd already spotted the woman and knew traffic wasn't the issue. What does your mom do for work, Sophie? She used to run a big company, Sophie replied, swinging her legs from the bench. But now she mostly stays home and talks to lawyers and accountants. She says grown-up business is very complicated. The little girl's tone suggested she'd heard this explanation many times. That does sound complicated, Marcus agreed, filing away this new information. A woman who used to run a company but now dealt with lawyers suggested major life changes, possibly divorce, bankruptcy, or worse. From her hiding spot, Victoria watched the mechanic talking with Sophie. She'd observed his act of kindness with the ice cream money, noted how he'd offered shelter and water without asking for anything in return. For the first time in months, someone had shown her daughter simple, uncomplicated kindness, and the realization both warmed and shattered her heart simultaneously. Victoria had been following Sophie's routine for weeks, always at a distance, always careful not to be seen. She knew about the after-school program Sophie had been dropped from due to unpaid fees. She knew about the days Sophie waited alone because Victoria couldn't bring herself to face the school staff's pitying looks, or the other parents' whispered conversations. Most painfully, she knew that Sophie never complained, never asked why Mommy couldn't pick her up like the other children's parents. The truth was that Victoria Ashworth was drowning in a sea of her own making. 18 months ago, she'd discovered that her late husband's business empire was built on fraudulent investments and hidden debts. Richard Ashworth had presented himself as a successful real estate developer, but after his sudden heart attack, Victoria learned he'd been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme that had defrauded hundreds of investors out of millions of dollars. The federal investigation had frozen their assets, seized their home, and left Victoria facing both criminal and civil litigation. Although prosecutors eventually determined she had no knowledge of her husband's crimes, the court of public opinion had been less forgiving. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Social clubs revoked her memberships, and the media painted her as either a criminal conspirator or a fool, too stupid to notice her husband's crimes. The shame had paralyzed her. Despite keeping custody of Sophie and receiving a small settlement that covered basic expenses, Victoria found herself unable to function in the world that had once seemed so natural. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or parent-teacher conferences became insurmountable challenges. She'd hired a nanny to handle daily care while she hid in their small rental apartment, venturing out only for legal appointments and desperate, distant glimpses of the daughter. She felt she'd failed completely. Marcus checked his watch and realized over an hour had passed since school let out. Sophie showed no signs of distress, but he couldn't ignore the woman who continued moving between hiding spots, like she was conducting surveillance rather than waiting to collect her child. "Sophie," he said gently, "would you mind if I called your mom, just to make sure she's okay?" Sophie's expression grew uncertain for the first time. "I don't think she'd want you to do that. She doesn't like talking to people she doesn't know." This answer raised more red flags in Marcus's mind. Has she always been shy around strangers? "No," Sophie replied thoughtfully. "She used to talk to everyone. She used to throw big parties and give speeches at fancy dinners. But that was before Daddy went to heaven and everything got complicated. The pieces began clicking into place for Marcus. A widowed mother, legal troubles, social isolation, and a child caught in the middle of circumstances beyond her understanding. He'd seen similar situations in his neighborhood families destroyed by events they couldn't control. People who'd lost not just their money, but their place in the world. Victoria watched Marcus talking intently with Sophie and felt panic rising. In her chest, what if he called social services? What if he decided she was an unfit mother for leaving Sophie waiting so long? The rational part of her mind knew she was being paranoid, but 18 months of legal battles and public scrutiny had eroded her ability to trust anyone's intentions. She stepped out from behind the mailbox, her decision made. Better to face the mechanic's questions than risk losing Sophie to well-meaning authorities who might not understand their situation. Victoria smoothed her designer blouse, checked her appearance in a car window, and walked across the street. With as much confidence as she could muster, Marcus saw her approach and felt his assumptions shifting once again. Up close, the woman was strikingly beautiful, probably in her mid-30s, with the kind of refined features that suggested generations of good breeding. But her eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of recent trauma, and her perfect posture couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders. "Sophie," she called softly as she approached the bench. The little girl's face lit up with genuine joy.
Mommy?
"I was starting to wonder if you got lost." She hopped off the bench and ran to her mother, who caught her in an embrace that seemed almost desperate in its intensity. "I'm sorry I'm late, sweetheart," Victoria murmured into Sophie's hair. I had some things to take care of." Marcus stood respectfully as mother and daughter reunited, but Victoria's eyes found his over Sophie's head. He expected to see embarrassment or defensiveness, but instead found something closer to gratitude mixed with profound sadness. "Mommy." "This is Marcus," Sophie announced, pulling back from the embrace. "He helped me buy ice cream when I didn't have enough money. He's really nice." Victoria straightened, her society training kicking in automatically. "I'm Victoria Ashworth," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Thank you for looking after Sophie." Marcus shook her hand, noting its slight tremor despite her composed exterior. Marcus Thompson. "It was no trouble at all. Sophie's a wonderful kid." "Yes, she is," Victoria agreed, her voice carrying a weight of emotion that seemed disproportionate to the simple statement. An awkward silence settled over the group. Sophie looked back and forth between the adults, sensing undercurrents she couldn't understand. Marcus felt compelled to say something, but wasn't sure what would be appropriate. Victoria appeared to be fighting some internal battle, opening her mouth to speak several times before closing it again. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. "Please let me reimburse you for the ice cream," she said, holding out a $20 bill. Marcus held up his hands. "That's not necessary, Mrs. Ashworth. It was just 63 cents. "Please," Victoria insisted, and Marcus heard something almost desperate in her tone. "I don't want to be in anyone's debt." This response struck Marcus as odd. Most parents would simply say, "Thank you for such a small kindness." Her insistence on immediate repayment suggested someone who'd learned to be wary of obligations, even tiny ones. "If it makes you feel better," Marcus said carefully, "but I want you to know it was genuinely my pleasure." Sophie was very polite and patient. Victoria's composure cracked slightly at this praise of her daughter. "She's learned to be patient," she said quietly, accepting the 20 back when Marcus refused it a second time. "Mommy," Sophie interjected, "Marcus has a really cool shop. Can we look inside sometime?" Panic flashed across Victoria's features so quickly, Marcus almost missed it. "We'll see, sweetheart. We should get going now." "Actually," Marcus said, surprising himself with his boldness, "if you ever need any car work done, I'd be happy to take a look. I try to keep my prices reasonable for neighbors." Victoria's laugh held no humor. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't actually own a car anymore." Admission seemed to embarrass her deeply, and Marcus realized he'd stumbled into another sensitive area. A woman who once threw parties and gave speeches now walked everywhere. With her daughter, another piece of the puzzle that was Victoria Ashworth's fallen life. "Well," Marcus said gently, "the offer stands if circumstances change." Victoria nodded stiffly and took Sophie's hand. "Say goodbye to Mr. Thompson, Sophie." "Goodbye, Marcus," Sophie said, waving enthusiastically. "Thank you again for the ice cream help." As they walked away, Marcus heard Sophie chattering excitedly about her day, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. But Victoria's responses were muted, distracted. Several times she looked back over her shoulder at Marcus, her expression unreadable. Marcus watched until they disappeared around the corner, then returned to his shop with more questions than answers. Something about the encounter had touched him deeply. Not just Sophie's innocent gratitude, but Victoria's obvious pain and the careful distance she maintained even from her own daughter. He spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about single mothers and the different ways people could be alone. Victoria Ashworth might have been surrounded by expensive things once, but she seemed more isolated than anyone he'd ever met. Her designer clothes and perfect manners couldn't hide the fact that she was drowning. And somehow her little daughter was managing to stay afloat despite having no real understanding of the depths beneath her. As evening approached and Marcus began closing up the shop, he found himself hoping he'd see them again. Not because he wanted to intrude, but because something told him that chance encounter had been important for all three of them. He didn't know that 2 blocks away, Victoria was sitting on the edge of Sophie's bed, watching her daughter color in a coloring book and wondering how long she could continue hiding from the world. The small wrapped package she'd been carrying all afternoon said unopened on Sophie's dresser, a birthday present Victoria had bought weeks ago but hadn't been able to bring herself to give. afraid that accepting her love might somehow contaminate the one pure thing left in her complicated life that night. For the first time in months, Victoria found herself thinking about someone other than lawyers, creditors, and the endless weight of shame that had become her constant companion. She thought about a mechanic with kind eyes who'd given her daughter ice cream money without expecting anything in return, and wondered what it might feel like to live in a world where such simple kindness still existed. 3 days passed before Marcus saw Sophie again, though he found himself glancing toward the elementary school more often than he cared to admit. The Honda Civic had been successfully repaired and returned to its grateful owner. He'd moved on to a challenging transmission job on a 1997 Ford pickup truck. The work required intense concentration, but his mind kept drifting to the little girl with the patient smile and her enigmatic mother who dressed like royalty but walked like someone carrying invisible chains. Thursday afternoon brought an unusual visitor to Thompson's auto repair. Marcus emerged from under the pickup's hood to find Sophie standing just inside his shop doorway, looking around with wide-eyed curiosity at the organized chaos of tools, parts, and machinery that filled the space. "Sophie?" Marcus said, quickly, wiping his hands clean. "What brings you by?" "I was walking home from school and saw your door was open," she replied, stepping carefully around a stack of tires. "Is it okay if I look around? I've never been inside a real mechanic shop before." Marcus glanced past her toward the street, expecting to see Victoria somewhere nearby, but the sidewalk was empty. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" "She had to go to another meeting with the lawyers," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Henderson from downstairs is supposed to watch me, but she fell asleep in front of her TV again. She does that a lot." This information raised immediate concerns for Marcus. A 7-year-old walking home alone from school and left with an elderly neighbor who wasn't properly supervising her painted a troubling picture of Victoria's current situation. "How far is your apartment from here?" Marcus asked. "It's 4 blocks. "That way," Sophie pointed east. "It's the red brick building with the broken sign out front. We live on the 3rd floor now instead of in our big house." The casual way Sophie mentioned their changed living circumstances struck Marcus as both heartbreaking and remarkable. Children adapted to new realities with a resilience that adults often lacked, but he wondered what other changes this little girl had accepted as normal. "Since you're here, would you like that tour?" Marcus offered. "I can show you how some of this equipment works." Sophie's face brightened considerably. "Really? Could you show me what makes cars run?" For the next hour, Marcus found himself playing an unexpected role as teacher and tour guide. Sophie proved to be an attentive student, asking thoughtful questions and listening carefully to his explanations. She was particularly fascinated by the hydraulic lift, watching in amazement as Marcus demonstrated how it could raise an entire vehicle into the air. "My daddy used to have a really fancy car," Sophie mentioned as they examined the engine of the pickup truck. "It was silver and made a purring sound when it started. Mommy said we had to give it back to the bank after Daddy went to heaven." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest whenever Sophie mentioned her father or their changed circumstances. "And what kind of car was it?" "A Mercedes something," Sophie replied, mispronouncing the name slightly. "It had leather seats that felt like butter and a sunroof that opened up to show the sky. I used to pretend I was flying when we drove with it open." The image of this little girl riding in luxury cars with sunroofs, now walking 4 blocks home from school to an apartment with a broken sign, crystallized the magnitude of Victoria's fall from grace. Marcus began to understand why the woman had seemed so fragile, so afraid of accepting even the smallest kindness. "Cars are just machines, Sophie," Marcus said gently. "They're nice to have, but they don't make people better or worse. What matters is the people inside them." Sophie considered this wisdom seriously. "Is that why you fix broken cars? It's to help the people inside them?" "That's exactly right," Marcus confirmed, impressed by her insight. "Everyone deserves to have reliable transportation, whether they're driving a Mercedes or a 20-year-old Honda." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the sidewalk outside. Victoria appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath and clearly agitated. She wore the same type of expensive clothes as before, but Marcus noticed they were wrinkled now, as if she'd been wearing them for too long or had slept in them. "Sophie Elizabeth Mitchell," Victoria exclaimed, using what was clearly her daughter's full name for disciplinary purposes. "I've been looking everywhere. For you, Mrs. Henderson said you never came home from school." Sophie's expression showed genuine confusion rather than guilt. "But Mrs. Henderson was sleeping when I knocked. I waited for 10 minutes, and she didn't answer, so I walked around to see the neighborhood. That's when I found Marcus's shop." Victorious. "You can't just wander off, sweetheart. I need to know where you are." "I'm sorry, Mommy," Sophie said, though Marcus could tell she didn't fully understand what she'd done wrong.
Marcus.
"Was showing me how engines work." "Did you know that cars need air and fuel and sparks to run, just like people need food and water? And sleep." Despite her distress, Victoria's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "No, I didn't know that." Marcus stepped forward, hoping to ease the tension. "Sophie was perfectly safe, Mrs. Ashworth. She's welcome here any time, though maybe next time she could let someone know where she's going." Victoria's eyes met his, and he saw a complexity of emotions, their gratitude. Embarrassment, fear, and something that might have been longing. "Thank you for looking after her," she said quietly. "Again, it's really no trouble," Marcus assured her. "Sophie's great company, and she asks excellent questions." "I do like questions," Sophie chimed in cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents between the adults. Victoria took a deep breath, visibly steeling herself for something. "Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology for the other day. I was ... I haven't been handling things very well lately. My circumstances have changed significantly, and I'm still learning how to navigate ... double quotes. She gestured vaguely. "All of this." Marcus recognized the careful language of someone accustomed to legal proceedings and public scrutiny. "You don't owe me any apologies, Mrs. Ashworth. We all do the best we can with what we're given." This simple statement seemed to hit Victoria unexpectedly hard. Her composure wavered, and for a moment, Marcus thought she might cry. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and took Sophie's hand. "We should get going," she said. "I'm sure Mr. Thompson has work to do." Actually, Marcus found himself saying, "I was about to close up for the day. Would you two like to get dinner somewhere? My treat?" The offer surprised even Marcus himself. He wasn't in the habit of inviting near strangers to dinner, especially when his own finances were stretched thin. But something about Victoria's barely contained desperation and Sophie's resilient cheerfulness made him want to extend. Whatever help he could, Victoria's automatic response was clearly going to be no, but Sophie spoke first. "Could we, Mommy?" "I'd like that very much." Victoria looked down at her daughter, then back at Marcus, clearly torn between her instinct to refuse and her desire to give Sophie something normal and pleasant. "I couldn't let you pay," Victoria said finally. "I may not have much right now, but I can still afford to buy dinner." "How about we compromise?" Marcus suggested. "There's a great little diner 6 blocks from here. Nothing fancy, but the food is honest and the prices are reasonable. We can split the check." Victoria hesitated for a long moment, and Marcus could almost see her weighing the risks of accepting his invitation against the appeal of a normal social interaction for both herself and Sophie. "All right," she agreed quietly, "but I insist on paying my share." The walk to Mel's diner took them through a part of the neighborhood that had seen better days but maintained a working-class dignity. Sophie skipped between the adults, pointing out interesting storefronts and asking questions about the businesses they passed. Her enthusiasm was infectious. Marcus noticed Victoria gradually relaxing as they walked. Mel's diner occupied a corner building that had probably been a pharmacy or 5 store decades earlier. The red vinyl booths were cracked, but clean, and the smell of honest cooking filled the air. They settled into a booth by the window, Sophie sliding in next to Marcus while Victoria sat across from them. "This is nice," Sophie announced, looking around with approval. "It feels like the diners in old movies." "You watch old movies?" Marcus asked, intrigued. "Mommy and I watch them together sometimes," Sophie replied. "She likes the ones where people dress up and dance, and I like the ones where families have adventures." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her. Sophie has a very sophisticated taste in classic films for someone her age. As they perused the simple menu, Marcus learned more about their current life. Victoria mentioned in passing that they'd been living in the apartment for 8 months, that Sophie attended Riverside Elementary because it was within walking distance, and that they were still sorting through some complicated legal matters related to her late husband's business affairs. Sophie, meanwhile, provided a child's perspective on their situation with refreshing honesty. She missed their old house, but liked being able to walk to school. She thought their apartment was cozy, even though the neighbors were sometimes loud. She wished her mother smiled more, but understood that grown-ups had complicated feelings about complicated things. When their food arrived, burgers and fries for Marcus and Sophie, a salad for Victoria, the conversation flowed more naturally. Victoria proved to be intelligent and well-educated, with opinions on everything from local politics to classic literature. Sophie contributed her own observations with the kind of unfiltered honesty that made both adults laugh.
Mommy used to
Give speeches at big dinners, Sophie mentioned, while stealing one of Marcus's French fries. She was really good at it. People would clap for a long time after she finished talking. Victoria's expression grew wistful. That feels like a different lifetime now. What kind of speeches? Marcus asked gently. Charity fundraisers, mostly. Victoria replied. I chaired several committees for children's causes, education, healthcare, poverty assistance. Her laugh held no humor. Marcus heard the shame in her voice and recognized it as the same shame he'd felt when his father died and left him with more debt than assets. There's no shame in needing help, he said quietly. We all need help sometimes. Some of us need more help than others, Victoria replied, her tone suggesting she was thinking of more than just financial assistance. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying their company. Sophie was delightful, curious, kind, and remarkably mature for her age. Victoria, when she allowed herself to relax, was intelligent and funny, with glimpses of the confident woman she must have been before her world collapsed. When the check arrived, Victoria insisted on examining it carefully and contributing exactly half, counting out bills from a wallet that Marcus noticed was nearly empty. The gesture was clearly important to her sense of dignity, so he accepted her payment without argument. As they prepared to leave, Sophie turned to Marcus with a serious expression. Marcus, are we friends now? I'd like that very much, Marcus replied. Are we friends, Sophie? Yes, she said decisively. Sophie looked thoughtful. Good, because I think Mommy could use more friends. Victoria's cheeks flushed, but she didn't contradict her daughter. Instead, she offered Marcus a small, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. Walking back toward their respective homes in the gathering dusk, Marcus realized the evening had changed something fundamental. Sophie had gained a friend. Victoria had experienced a few hours of normal human interaction, and he had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected connections could brighten even the darkest circumstances. He didn't know that this simple dinner would set in motion a series of events that would transform all their lives in ways none of them could imagine. The following week brought an unexpected rhythm to Marcus's days. Sophie began stopping by the shop regularly on her way home from school, always with Victoria's permission and usually bearing small gifts, a drawing of his garage, a sandwich she'd made herself, or flowers picked from the weedy lot behind their apartment building. Victoria would arrive precisely at 5:30 to collect her, and the three of them had fallen into an easy pattern of conversation that felt surprisingly natural. Friday afternoon, however, brought complications Marcus hadn't anticipated. He was bent over the engine of a vintage Mustang when a sleek black sedan pulled up outside his shop. 3 men in expensive suits emerged, their presence immediately transforming the atmosphere of his modest garage from comfortable to intimidating. The lead man, tall and silver-haired, with the predatory bearing of someone accustomed to wielding power, surveyed the shop with obvious disdain before his eyes settled on Marcus. Mr. Thompson, the man inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. That's me, Marcus replied, straightening up and wiping his hands on his coveralls. What can I do for you, gentlemen? My name is Charles Whitman, the man announced, as if the name should carry weight. I represent certain financial interests that have been monitoring recent developments in this neighborhood. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air filtering through his open garage door. I'm not sure what you mean. Whitman stepped closer, flanked by his companions, who remained silent but menacing. It's come to our attention that you've been associating with Victoria Ashworth and her daughter. The mention of Victoria's name sent alarm bells ringing in Marcus's head. I'm not sure how that's any of your business. Everything concerning Mrs. Ashworth is our business, Whitman replied smoothly. You see, her late husband owed substantial sums to various creditors, both legitimate financial institutions and private parties who were less conventional in their lending practices. Marcus felt the pieces of a much darker puzzle beginning to fall into place. What does that have to do with me? Perhaps nothing, Whitman conceded, though his smile held no warmth. However, we've observed that Mrs. Ashworth has been spending considerable time in your establishment. Given her family's history of creative financial arrangements, we felt it prudent to ensure you understand the situation fully. One of Whitman's companions, a younger man with cold eyes and an expensive haircut, spoke for the first time. Mrs. Ashworth's husband died owing $12 million to people who don't typically write off bad debts. The federal government may have cleared her of criminal charges, but that doesn't eliminate her moral obligations to her husband's creditors. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. Are you threatening her? Not at all, Whitman said, his tone remaining conversational. We're simply ensuring that anyone who might be influenced by Mrs. Ashworth's considerable charm understands the full scope of her circumstances. She has a history of attracting well-meaning individuals who subsequently find themselves entangled in her family's legal difficulties. I think you should leave, Marcus said firmly. Though he was acutely aware that 3 men in $1,000 suits probably had resources he couldn't begin to match. Of course, Whitman agreed pleasantly. But before we go, perhaps you'd be interested to know that Mrs. Ashworth wasn't entirely honest about her current living situation. The apartment she and her daughter occupy? It's being subsidized by a court-appointed trustee managing what remains of the Ashworth estate. Her designer clothes, purchased before the bankruptcy, now carefully maintained because she can't afford to replace them. It's the third man, who had remained silent until now, added quietly, She's not just poor, Miss Thompson. She's completely dependent on the goodwill of the court system and the charity of others. Ask yourself why a woman of her background would suddenly take an interest in a working-class mechanic. What might she need from you? Marcus felt sick to his stomach, not because he believed their insinuations about Victoria's motives, because he was beginning to understand the full scope of the nightmare she and Sophie were living through. Get out of my shop, he said. Quietly, certainly, Whitman replied. But do consider what we've told you. Mrs. Ashworth has a gift for making people care about her, and those people often find themselves facing consequences they never anticipated. The 3 men departed as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving Marcus standing in his garage with a head full of ugly possibilities and a growing certainty that Victoria and Sophie were in far more danger than he'd realized. 20 minutes later, Sophie burst through the door with her usual enthusiasm, carrying a small potted plant in a cracked ceramic container. Marcus, I brought you something for your shop, she announced, holding up the plant proudly. Ms. Henderson said, It's called a spider plant, and it's really hard to kill, so it's perfect for beginners. Marcus forced a smile, though his conversation with Whitman still had his nerves on edge. It's very thoughtful, Sophie. Where should we put it? They spent several minutes finding the perfect spot for the plant on Marcus's cluttered workbench, Sophie providing detailed instructions about light requirements and watering schedules with the seriousness of a professional horticulturist. Marcus said carefully as they arranged the plant, Has your mom mentioned anything about people coming to talk to her? Be people she doesn't know very well? Sophie's expression grew thoughtful. You mean besides the lawyers and the court people? There was a man who came to our apartment last week. He made Mommy cry after he left. Marcus felt his protective instincts surge. Do you remember anything about this man? He had white hair and a really nice car, Sophie replied. Mommy told me to go to my room while they talked, but I could hear her voice getting scared. After he left, she sat on the couch and cried for a long time. The description matched Whitman perfectly. Marcus realized Victoria had been dealing with these intimidation tactics without telling anyone. The thought of that silver-haired predator reducing Victoria to tears while her daughter listened from another room filled Marcus with a rage he hadn't felt since his father's death. "Has she talked to anyone about these visits?" Marcus asked. Gently. "I don't think Mommy has anyone to talk to," Sophie said, with the matter-of-fact sadness that children sometimes display when discussing adult problems. "She used to have lots of friends, but they don't come around anymore. Sometimes she calls her sister in California, but those conversations always end with Mommy looking more sad than before." Victoria arrived precisely at 5:30, as had become her habit, but Marcus immediately noticed the strain in her face. Dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights, and her usually perfect composure seemed brittle, as if it might shatter at any moment. "How was your day, sweetheart?" she asked Sophie, but her eyes remained fixed on Marcus, as if trying to read something in his expression. "Marcus and I planted my spider plant," Sophie reported cheerfully. "He said it's going to live on his workbench and be the official shop plant." "That's wonderful," Victoria said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. Marcus made his decision. "Mrs. Ashworth, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Victoria's expression immediately became guarded. "Sophie, would you mind checking on the plant one more time? Make sure we didn't forget anything important." Once Sophie was safely occupied across the garage, Victoria turned to Marcus with an expression that mixed dread with resignation. "Someone came to see you today, didn't they?" Marcus nodded grimly. 3 men in suits. The leader called himself Charles Whitman. Victoria's face went white. "What did he tell you?" "Told me a lot of things," Marcus replied carefully. "Most of them are designed to make me afraid of being associated with you and Sophie. The question is, how much of it was true?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. She pressed her hands to her face, taking several shaky breaths before looking up at Marcus with eyes bright with unshed tears. "All of it, probably," she whispered. "Richard, my husband, he wasn't just running a Ponzi scheme. He was laundering money for some very dangerous people. When he died, those people expected me to honor his debts, regardless of what the federal courts decided." Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. "That's why you've been hiding. You're not just dealing with bankruptcy and social stigma. You're dealing with actual threats. They've made it clear that Sophie and I are collateral for Richard's unpaid obligations," Victoria said, her voice barely audible. "They can't touch the legal settlement I received. It's protected by federal oversight. But they can make our lives impossible in other ways." "Is that why you were watching Sophie from a distance that first day?" Victoria nodded miserably. "I was afraid to approach her directly. These people have made it clear they're always watching, and I didn't want to put her in danger by being too close. But I couldn't stand the thought of her sitting there alone either." Marcus understood now why Victoria had seemed so desperate. To maintain distance? Why she'd insisted on paying for dinner? Why she watched her daughter with such painful longing? She wasn't just dealing with shame. She was trying to protect Sophie from dangers that went far beyond social embarrassment. "What did Whitman want from you specifically?" Marcus asked. "Information about you," Victoria replied. "They wanted to know if you had money, if you owned property, if you might be someone they could leverage for additional payment. They're convinced I'm working some kind of angle, using Sophie to manipulate sympathetic people." The ugliness of the accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. These people had taken Victoria's desperate love for her daughter and twisted it into something calculating and mercenary. "That's ridiculous," Marcus said firmly. "Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you and Sophie can see how genuine your relationship is. But you understand now why I can't." Victoria gestured helplessly between them. "Why this friendship, as much as I treasure it, might not be safe for any of us." Marcus looked across the garage where Sophie was carefully adjusting the position of her plant, humming softly to herself as she worked. The idea of cutting ties with this little girl who had brightened his days immeasurably was unthinkable. But the idea of putting her in danger was even worse. "What if we found a way to make you safe?" Marcus asked quietly. "What if there was a solution that didn't involve you and Sophie living in fear?" Victoria's laugh held no humor. "Marcus, these aren't people you negotiate with. They're not interested in payment plans or reasonable settlements. They want $12 million, and they believe I have access to money I'm hiding from the courts, do you? No, Victoria said emphatically. Everything Richard hid, the federal investigators found. Every account, every asset, every secret investment, it's all been seized or returned to victims. I'm living on a court-supervised allowance that barely covers rent and groceries. Marcus believed her completely. The desperation in her voice, the careful way she managed their modest expenses, the visible strain of maintaining appearances while living hand-to-mouth, none of it could be faked convincingly. Then we need to find another solution, Marcus said, with more confidence than he felt. There is no other solution, Victoria replied. The only thing protecting Sophie and me right now is staying invisible, not drawing attention, not giving these people any reason to escalate their threats. And what happens when Sophie gets older and starts asking questions about why her mother is afraid of shadows? What happens when she wants to have friends over or participate in school activities? This isn't sustainable, Victoria. Victoria flinched. At hearing her first name from his lips, though whether from surprise or something else, Marcus couldn't tell. I know it's not sustainable, she said quietly. I just don't know what else to do. Every lawyer I've consulted says the same thing. These debts aren't legally enforceable. But that doesn't make the people demanding payment any less dangerous. Marcus watched Sophie across the garage, still tending to her plant with the careful attention she brought to everything she cared about. This little girl deserved better than a life spent looking over her shoulder, and her mother deserved better than being trapped by dead husband's sins. Let me think about this, Marcus said finally. There might be options you haven't considered. Victoria shook her head. Marcus, I appreciate everything you've done for us, but please don't get more involved than you already are. These people have already noticed you. They think you're trying to help me. Let me worry about that, Marcus interrupted. You've been carrying this alone for too long. For a moment, Victoria looked like she might argue further. Then her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, and Marcus realized she was simply too tired to keep fighting everyone, including people who wanted to help her. Just promise me you'll be careful, she said quietly. Sophie has already lost her father. I can't bear the thought of her losing anyone else because of my family's mistakes. Marcus promised, though he was already formulating plans that would definitely not qualify as careful. Sometimes protecting the people you cared about required taking risks that went far beyond careful. As Victoria and Sophie prepared to leave, Sophie ran back to give Marcus an unexpected hug. Thank you for taking care of my plant, she whispered. And thank you for taking care of Mommy, too. She's been less sad since we met you. Marcus hugged her back, making a silent promise that he would find a way to ensure this remarkable little girl could grow up without fear casting shadows over her bright spirit. Marcus spent the weekend researching everything he could find about Richard Ashworth's case, Victoria's legal situation, the shadowy world of private debt collection that operated in the gray areas between legitimate business and organized crime. What he discovered painted an even grimmer picture than Victoria had described. But it also revealed potential avenues she might not have considered. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to his shop. Detective Sarah Chen of the Metropolitan Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit arrived in an unmarked sedan. Her badge and business card identifying her as someone who might actually be able to help rather than intimidate. Mr. Thompson, Detective Chen said as she examined his modest operation. I understand you've recently become acquainted with Victoria Ashworth and her daughter. Marcus tensed, wondering if this was another intimidation tactic disguised as official business. Is that a crime? It's not at all, Chen replied with a slight smile. In fact, it might be exactly what we've been hoping for. See, we've been trying to build a case against the people who've been harassing Mrs. Ashworth, but she's been understandably reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement. Can you blame her? Marcus asked. From what I understand, the legal system hasn't exactly been her friend lately. Detective Chen nodded sympathetically. The federal investigation into her husband's crimes was thorough but necessarily narrow in scope. They focused on financial fraud and money laundering. But the organized crime connections were handled by different agencies with different priorities. Mrs. Ashworth fell through the cracks. What kind of help are we talking about? Marcus asked. Cautiously. People threatening Mrs. Ashworth, Charles Whitman, and his associates, they're not just debt collectors. They're part of a sophisticated operation that uses the legitimate legal system as cover for extortion and intimidation. We've been building a RICO case against them for 2 years, but we need witnesses willing to testify. Marcus felt a spark of hope for the first time since Whitman's threatening visit. What would that mean for Victoria and Sophie? If Mrs. Ashworth agrees to cooperate, we can offer federal witness protection during the investigation and trial, complete relocation, new identities, financial support until the case is resolved. After that, depending on the outcome, they could choose to return to their lives here or start fresh somewhere else. The prospect of losing Victoria and Sophie entirely was almost as devastating as the thought of them remaining in danger. But Marcus knew it might be their only real chance at freedom. There's something else, Detective Chen continued. We have reason to believe that Richard Ashworth hid assets that the federal investigators never found. Not just from the Ponzi scheme, but legitimate investments and property acquisitions that predated his criminal activities. If we can locate those assets, Mrs. Ashworth might be able to recover enough money to satisfy her husband's creditors through legal channels. How much money are we talking about? Potentially millions, Chen replied. Richard Ashworth was a successful real estate developer before he turned to crime. He owned property across 3 states, held investments in legitimate businesses, and maintained several accounts that appear to have been funded through legal means. The problem is that all his records were either destroyed or encrypted before his death. Marcus absorbed this information, understanding that Detective Chen was offering more than just protection. She was offering the possibility of a real solution to Victoria's nightmare. What would you need from me? Marcus asked. Access, Chen said simply. Mrs. Ashworth trusts you, and trust is something she's understandably short on these days. We might be able to offer her something she's never had before, way out that doesn't involve running for the rest of her life. After Detective Chen left, Marcus spent the rest of the day thinking about how to approach Victoria with this information. He knew she'd be suspicious of any government involvement, given how thoroughly the federal investigation had upended her life. But he also knew that the current situation was unsustainable, and that Sophie deserved better than a childhood spent in hiding. Tuesday afternoon brought Sophie's usual visit, but this time she seemed subdued, lacking her normal enthusiasm for their conversations about engines and machinery. Is everything all right, sweetheart? Marcus asked, as they sat together on his workbench sharing the sandwich she'd brought. Mommy had another bad night, Sophie said quietly. She was walking around the apartment really late and I heard her crying in the bathroom. When I asked her about it this morning, she said grown-ups sometimes have worried dreams. Marcus felt his resolve strengthen. Victoria was clearly reaching a breaking point, and Sophie was bearing witness to her mother's deterioration. Something had to change before the situation became even worse. Sophie, Marcus said carefully, what would you think if someone told you there might be a way to help your mommy not be so worried all the time? Sophie's eyes brightened with hope. Really? Someone could do that? Maybe, Marcus replied. But it would mean your mommy would have to be very brave and trust some new people. Do you think she could do that? Sophie considered this question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Mommy used to be the bravest person I knew. She would speak in front of hundreds of people and never seem scared at all. But since Daddy went to heaven, she gets scared of lots of things. What kinds of things? Phone calls from numbers she doesn't know, people knocking on our door, going to the grocery store when there are too many people there. Sometimes she gets scared just walking down the street, and I don't know why. Marcus understood that Victoria was exhibiting classic symptoms of trauma-induced anxiety, made worse by the very real threats she faced daily. The brave, confident woman who had once commanded boardrooms and charity galas was still there. But she was buried under layers of fear and shame that had accumulated over 18 months of constant stress. When Victoria arrived to collect Sophie, Marcus immediately noticed the strain in her appearance had worsened since Friday. Her clothes, while still impeccably maintained, hung more loosely on her frame, suggesting she'd been losing weight. Her hands showed a slight tremor that she tried to hide by keeping them clasped together. Victoria, Marcus said after Sophie had run to check on her plant. had an interesting visitor yesterday. Someone who might be able to help." Victoria's expression immediately became guarded. "What kind of help?" Marcus outlined his conversation with Detective Chen. Watching Victoria's face cycle through disbelief, hope, and fear as he explained the possibilities. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "They want me to testify against Whitman and his people," she said finally. "They want to offer you protection while you testify," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference, is there?" Victoria asked bitterly. "The last time I trusted federal agents, they seized everything I owned and plastered my face across every newspaper in the state. My husband's victims spat at me in courthouse hallways, and former friends acted like I was carrying a contagious disease." Marcus understood her reluctance, but he also saw the toll that living in constant fear was taking on both Victoria and Sophie. "What's the alternative? Spending the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders?" Watching Sophie grow up thinking this is normal. Victoria glanced across the garage where Sophie was carefully watering her plant with a small cup of water Marcus kept for that purpose. The little girl's dedication to nurturing something growing and alive stood in stark contrast to the barren landscape of fear that dominated the rest of her life. "She asks me sometimes why we moved to the apartment," Victoria said quietly. "Don't we have a car anymore? I don't have friends over like other mommies do. I keep telling her that things are just complicated right now, but she's getting older. Soon she's going to start asking questions I can't answer without lying to her. Then maybe it's time to consider other options," Marcus suggested gently. Victoria was quiet for another moment, then looked up at Marcus with an expression that mixed desperation with something that might have been determination. "If I agree to meet with this detective, will you come with me?" she asked. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't think I can face another government interrogation alone." "Of course," Marcus replied without hesitation. "When would you want to?" "Do this tomorrow?" Victoria said, as if she needed to commit before she lost her nerve. "If I think about it too long, I'll talk myself out of it." Marcus nodded and made a mental note to call Detective Chen first thing in the morning. As Victoria and Sophie prepared to leave, Sophie hugged Marcus goodbye, as had become her habit. "Is Mommy going to be less worried soon?" she whispered in his ear. "I hope so, sweetheart," Marcus whispered back. "We're going to try very hard, too. Make that happen." After they left, Marcus stood in his garage, thinking about the conversation ahead. Detective Chen had painted an optimistic picture of what law enforcement could offer. But Marcus knew that government promises often came with complications and unintended consequences. Victoria had every reason to be suspicious of official help, given how thoroughly the system had failed to protect her from her husband's legacy. But as he thought about Sophie's bright spirit dimmed by worry for her mother, and Victoria's gradual deterioration under the weight of constant fear, Marcus realized that taking risks was sometimes the only path to safety. The current situation was slowly destroying both of them, and doing nothing wasn't really an option anymore. That evening, Marcus called Detective Chen to arrange the meeting. As he hung up the phone, he found himself hoping that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter for Victoria and Sophie, one written in hope rather than fear. With possibilities instead of limitations, he didn't know that across town, Charles Whitman was having his own phone conversations, making plans that would soon force everyone involved to move much faster than they'd anticipated. The game was about to change dramatically, and the stakes would become higher than anyone imagined. Wednesday morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Marcus's mood as he prepared for what might be the most important conversation of Victoria's life. He'd arranged to meet her at a neutral location, a small coffee shop 6 blocks from the police station. Before they went together to speak with, Detective Chen. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table near the back where they could speak privately. Victoria appeared precisely on time, looking pale but determined. She'd dressed carefully in one of her better outfits, as if armor against whatever revelations the day might bring. "Thank you for doing this with me," she said as she sat down across from him. "I don't think I would have had the courage to go alone." "You're braver than you think," Marcus replied. "It takes tremendous courage to even consider this option." Victoria ordered coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and Marcus noticed she'd applied makeup carefully to hide the dark circles under her eyes. Despite her efforts, She looked fragile, like someone who'd been pushed to the very edge of her endurance. She said quietly, "Before we go to see Detective Chen, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned before, but I was afraid of what you'd think." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, wondering what additional complications Victoria had been hiding. "What is it?" Victoria took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "The night before Richard died, he gave me something. Safety deposit box key and a set of written instructions. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should wait 6 months and then follow the instructions exactly. Did you follow them?" "No," Victoria said quietly. "I was so angry at him for what he'd done, so hurt by the lies and the betrayal, that I threw the key and the instructions in a drawer and tried to forget they existed. Part of me thought that following his final instructions would make me complicit in whatever schemes he'd been running." Marcus understood her reasoning, but he also realized she might have been sitting on the solution to her problems for over a year. "Do you still have them?" "Yes," Victoria replied. "They are in a jewelry box in my bedroom. I've been afraid to use them because I was convinced they'd lead to more criminal evidence, more legal troubles. But last night, after our conversation, I started thinking that maybe Richard left those instructions for exactly this kind of situation." "What did the instructions say?" Victoria closed her eyes, clearly reciting from memory. "Wait 6 months. Go to First National Bank on Elm Street. Ask for the safety deposit box registered under the name Mitchell Holdings. Use the key. Take everything in the box to attorney Sarah Martinez in Phoenix, Arizona. Tell her that Richard sent you and that you need to activate the contingency plan." Marcus felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "Mitchell, that's Sophie's middle name, my maiden name," Victoria confirmed. "Richard always said it was the name he trusted most in the world." The implications were staggering. If Richard Ashworth had been smart enough to separate legitimate assets from his criminal enterprises, and if he'd established a legal mechanism for transferring those assets to Victoria in case of emergency, then Detective Chen's optimistic assessment might be conservative. "Victoria," Marcus said carefully, "I think you need to tell Detective Chen about this. It could change everything." Victoria nodded, though her expression remained apprehensive. "I know. But Marcus, what if following those instructions makes things worse instead of better? What if it implicates me in crimes I knew nothing about? What if it puts Sophie in even more danger?" Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, noting how cold and fragile it felt in his. "Then we'll deal with whatever comes. But living in fear isn't protecting Sophie, it's teaching her that the world is a place where good people have to hide from bad ones. Is that really the lesson you want her to learn?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded with growing determination. "No, it's not." As they walked toward the police station together, Marcus found himself thinking about the strange series of events that had brought them to this moment. It had started with 63 cents and a strawberry popsicle. But it was becoming something much larger, a chance for redemption, justice, and perhaps even healing for a family that had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Next few hours would determine whether that chance became reality or remained just another broken promise in a life that had seen to many of them already. Detective Chen's office occupied a corner of the Metropolitan Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, its walls lined with case files and evidence boxes that told stories of white-collar crimes spanning decades. She welcomed Marcus and Victoria with professional warmth, offering coffee and settling them in comfortable chairs arranged around a small conference table rather than the intimidating interrogation setup Victoria had feared. "Mrs. Ashworth," Detective Chen began, "I want you to understand that this conversation is entirely voluntary. You're not under investigation. And anything you tell me will be used solely to build our case against the people who've been threatening you and your daughter." Victoria nodded stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Thompson said, "You might be able to offer protection," Chen confirmed. "But before we discuss specifics, I'd like to understand exactly what you've been dealing with. Can you tell me about your interactions with Charles Whitman and his associates?" For the next hour, Victoria recounted 18 months of escalating intimidation. Phone calls at all hours demanding payment of debts that weren't legally enforceable. Visits to her apartment where well-dressed men implied terrible consequences. If she didn't find a way to access money, they were convinced she was hiding. Surveillance that made her feel like a prisoner in her own life. Afraid to go anywhere or do anything that might trigger retaliation, Detective Chen took careful notes, occasionally asking for specific details about dates, names, and threats. Her questions were professional, but gentle, clearly designed to gather evidence without re-traumatizing Victoria further. "The federal investigation into your husband's crimes," Chen said when Victoria finished, "concluded that you had no knowledge of his illegal activities. Do you still maintain that position?" "Absolutely," Victoria replied firmly. "Richard handled all our finances. I signed papers when he asked me to, attended business dinners when he needed a hostess, and believed everything he told me about his work. I was naive, but I wasn't complicit." "What about assets?" Chen asked. "The federal investigators seized everything they could locate, but Richard Ashworth was clearly sophisticated in hiding money. Is it possible he concealed legitimate assets along with the proceeds from his crimes?" Victoria exchanged a glance with Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "There might be something," she said quietly. Victoria explained about the safety deposit box key and Richard's cryptic instructions, watching Detective Chen's expression grow increasingly interested as the story unfolded. "Mitchell Holdings," Chen repeated when Victoria finished. "Have you researched that name?" "I was afraid to," Victoria admitted. "Thought it might be another criminal enterprise, something that would implicate me if I got involved." Detective Chen was already turning to her computer, typing rapidly. After several minutes of searching, her expression shifted to one of surprise and then excitement. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said, turning the screen so Victoria could see Mitchell Holdings is a legitimate real estate investment company incorporated in Arizona 18 months before your husband's death. According to these records, it owns commercial properties in Phoenix, Denver, Austin, worth an estimated $15 million. Victoria stared at the screen in disbelief. "That's impossible. The federal investigators would have found something that large." "Not necessarily," Chen replied. "If your husband established this company using only premarital assets and kept it completely separate from his criminal activities, it might not have appeared in any of the financial records they seized. The incorporation documents list the primary beneficiary as Victoria Elizabeth Mitchell, your maiden name." Marcus felt a surge of hope watching Victoria process this information. If Richard had indeed established a legitimate business using only clean money, it might be enough to satisfy his criminal creditors and free Victoria from their threats permanently. "There's more," Chen continued, scrolling through additional documents. "The company appears to own several other subsidiary businesses, all in legitimate industries: property management, construction, commercial lending. The total value could be substantially higher than $15 million. Victoria's hands trembled as she absorbed the implications. "But why would Richard hide this from me? Why not tell me about it during the investigation?" "Because he was protecting you," Chen suggested. "If the federal prosecutors had known about these assets, they might have seized them as part of the criminal proceedings, regardless of their legitimate origins. By keeping them secret and establishing you as the sole beneficiary," he ensured, "you'd have resources to rebuild your life after the criminal cases were resolved." "But the instructions said to wait 6 months, Victoria pointed out. "Why the delay?" "Probably to ensure the federal investigation was complete, and that accessing these assets wouldn't trigger additional scrutiny," Chen explained. "Your husband may have been a criminal, but he was clearly a careful planner." Marcus leaned forward, thinking through the practical implications. If Victoria accesses these assets now, 2 years after Richard's death, Ken Whitman and his people still claim them as payment for the criminal debts? Detective Chen shook her head. "Not legally. These appear to be legitimate business holdings established with clean money before Richard's criminal activities began. They're completely separate from the Ponzi scheme assets that were seized. If Mrs. Ashworth can prove ownership through the proper legal channels, she'd have every right to use these assets however she chooses, including paying off her husband's criminal debts to make the threats stop?" Victoria asked quietly. "If that's what you choose to do," Chen confirmed. "Though I'd strongly recommend working through the legal system rather than negotiating directly with criminals. We can facilitate legitimate debt settlement discussions that would formally resolve these claims and prevent future harassment. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, staring at the computer screen that displayed more wealth than she'd dared hope for in her darkest moments. The possibility of financial security was overwhelming enough, but the prospect of freedom from fear for herself and Sophie was almost too good to believe. "What would I need to do?" she asked finally. "First, we'd need to accompany you to Phoenix to meet with the attorney mentioned in your husband's instructions," Chen replied. "Sarah Martinez appears to be a legitimate estate planning attorney with offices in Scottsdale. If she has additional documentation about these holdings, she can help establish your legal ownership and guide the asset transfer process." "What? About Whitman and his people?" Marcus asked. "If they're watching Victoria, won't they notice if she suddenly starts taking trips to Arizona?" "That's where our witness protection offer becomes relevant," Chen explained. "If Mrs. Ashworth agrees to testify against Whitman's organization, we can provide security during the asset recovery process. Once she has legal control of these holdings, she'll have leverage to negotiate a permanent resolution to the harassment." Victoria looked at Marcus, seeking reassurance in his steady gaze. "What do you think I should do?" Marcus considered the risks and possibilities carefully. "I think Sophie deserves to grow up without fear, and you deserve to live without constantly looking over your shoulder. This might be your only chance to achieve both of those things." "There is one more consideration," Detective Chen added gently. "Our intelligence suggests that Whitman's organization is becoming increasingly desperate. They've been unsuccessful in recovering significant assets from other targets, and their patience with the current arrangement is wearing thin. We believe they may be planning to escalate their tactics soon." The unspoken implication hung in the air. If Victoria didn't act soon, the threats might become much more than just intimidation. "How long would the process take?" Victoria asked. "If everything goes smoothly, we could have you in Phoenix within a week," Chen replied. "Asset verification and transfer might take several additional weeks. But once you have legal documentation of ownership, you'd be in a much stronger position." Victoria stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city, where she'd once been a respected member of society and was now essentially a refugee in her own life. The weight of 18 months of fear and uncertainty seemed to settle on her shoulders as she contemplated this unexpected lifeline. "Mrs. Ashworth," Detective Chen said softly, "I understand this is an enormous decision. Take whatever time you need to consider your options." Victoria turned back to face them, and Marcus saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a flicker of the confident woman she'd once been. The one who had commanded boardrooms and charity galas with grace and authority. "Do it," she said quietly but firmly. "Whatever it takes to give Sophie a normal life, I'll do it." Detective Chen smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Marcus had seen from her. "I think you're making the right choice. Let me start making some phone calls." As they left the police station an hour later, Victoria seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing her burden with people who could actually help had lifted some of the weight she'd been carrying alone. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting golden light across the sidewalk where they walked. "Marcus," Victoria said as they approached his truck, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to feel free to say no." "What is it?" Detective Chen suggested that having a trusted friend accompany me to Phoenix might be helpful, both for emotional support and as an additional witness to whatever we discover. "Would you consider coming with me?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Of course. But what about Sophie? She can't miss school for a week, and I don't think taking her into this situation would be wise." Victoria had clearly already considered this. Detective Chen mentioned that witness protection could include temporary placement for Sophie with a trained foster family people who specialize in caring for children whose parents are involved. In federal cases, it would only be for a few days and she'd be completely safe. The thought of Sophie staying with strangers was difficult, but Marcus recognized the necessity. "What will you tell her about where you're going?" "The truth," Victoria said with surprising firmness. "Or at least an appropriate version of it. Sophie's old enough to understand that Mommy needs to take care of some grown-up business that might help make our lives better. She's been living with uncertainty for so long that a few days of structure with caring people might actually be a relief." As they drove back toward Marcus's shop, both lost in thought about the dramatic changes ahead, neither of them noticed. The The black sedan that had been following them since they left the police station. Charles Whitman had invested considerable resources in monitoring Victoria's activities, and her visit to law enforcement had triggered immediate alerts throughout his organization. By evening, Whitman would know about Detective Chen's investigation, the planned trip to Phoenix, and Marcus's growing involvement in Victoria's situation. The game was about to become much more dangerous. The timeline for everyone's safety was about to accelerate dramatically. But for now, driving through the afternoon sunshine with the possibility of hope replacing the certainty of despair, Victoria allowed herself to imagine a future where Sophie could be just a normal little girl with a mother who wasn't afraid to live in the world. It was a beautiful dream, and for the first time in 18 months, it might actually be within reach. That evening, Victoria sat on Sophie's bed as her daughter completed her homework. Watching the careful concentration with which Sophie approached each math problem, the normalcy of the moment a mother helping her child with schoolwork felt precious in a way that most parents never had to experience. "Mommy," Sophie said as she finished the last problem, "you seem different today." "Less worried?" Victoria smiled, smoothing Sophie's hair back from her face. I'm less worried, sweetheart. Some people are going to help us with the complicated grown-up problems, and that means things might get much better very soon." "Does that mean we might not have to be scared anymore?" Sophie asked, with the direct honesty that children used when discussing things adults preferred to avoid. "I hope so, baby," Victoria replied. "I really hope so." As Sophie prepared for bed, Victoria found herself thinking about the conversation she'd need to have with her daughter about the temporary separation. It would be difficult, but it was also the first step toward a future where such separations wouldn't be necessary, for the first time since Richard's death. Victoria fell asleep without checking the locks on her door 3 times or lying awake, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but tonight, she allowed herself to rest in the possibility that her nightmare might finally be ending. Thursday morning arrived with an urgency that shattered the cautious optimism of the previous day. Marcus was opening his shop when his phone rang at 6:47 a.m. "Detective." Chen's voice carried a tension that immediately put him on high alert. "We need to move faster than planned," Chen said without preamble. "Our surveillance team detected unusual activity around Mrs. Ashworth's building last night. 3 vehicles, rotating shifts, professional-grade equipment. Whitman's people are escalating their monitoring." Marcus felt ice settle in his stomach. "Is Victoria safe?" "We have undercover officers in the area, but this level of surveillance suggests they're planning something more aggressive than their usual intimidation tactics. We need to get Mrs. Ashworth and her daughter into protective custody today." "What?" "About Phoenix, the attorney meeting. We're accelerating everything. There's a flight leaving for Phoenix at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Mrs. Ashworth and you will be on it, accompanied by federal marshals. Sophie will be placed with our best foster family. The Hendersons specialize in temporary placements for federal witnesses' children." Marcus closed his eyes, understanding that the leisurely timeline they'd discussed yesterday had just collapsed into a frantic race against time. "Does Victoria know?" "I'm calling her next." "Can you meet us at the federal building at 11? We'll need to brief both of you on security protocols and finalize the protective custody arrangements." After ending the call, Marcus stood in his garage surrounded by the familiar tools and machinery that had defined his life for years. Knowing that everything was about to change dramatically, the simple act of buying a little girl ice cream had set in motion events that were now spiraling beyond anyone's control. 2 hours later, the federal building buzzed with activity as teams of agents prepared for what Detective Chen described as a complex asset recovery operation. Victoria arrived looking pale but determined, carrying a small overnight bag and holding Sophie's hand tightly. Sophie, dressed in her best school clothes and carrying her favorite stuffed rabbit, seemed more curious than frightened by the official atmosphere. Her resilience continued to amaze Marcus's little girl who had adapted to poverty. Isolation and constant fear was now facing another upheaval with characteristic grace. "Mommy explained that I get to stay with a nice family while she takes care of important business," Sophie told Marcus as they waited in the briefing room. "She said it's like a sleepover, but longer." Marcus knelt down to Sophie's eye level, struck by how matter-of-factly she accepted these extraordinary circumstances. "Are you okay with that, sweetheart?" "I guess so," Sophie replied thoughtfully. "I've never had a sleepover before, so I don't really know what to expect. But Mommy says the people are very kind, and they have a dog named Charlie." Victoria, overhearing this conversation, looked stricken. "You've never had a sleepover because we haven't been able to... ... she began, then stopped, clearly overwhelmed by another reminder of how much her circumstances had limited Sophie's childhood experiences. "It's okay, Mommy," Sophie said, with the wisdom that children sometimes displayed in crisis situations. "After you finish the important business, maybe I can have regular sleepovers with friends from school." The casual assumption that there would be a normal future with school friends and typical childhood activities hit Victoria like a physical blow. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back tears. Agent Jennifer Walsh, the federal marshal assigned to coordinate their protection, arrived with manila folders containing travel documents and security protocols. She was a compact woman, in her 40s, with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone accustomed to handling high-stakes situations. "Mrs. Ashworth," Agent Walsh began, "I want to assure you that Sophie will be in excellent hands. The Henderson family has been caring for federal witnesses' children for over a decade. They understand the unique stresses these situations create, and they're trained to provide both security and emotional support." "How long will Sophie need to stay with them?" Victoria asked. "Ideally no more than a week," Walsh replied. "Our Phoenix operation should be straightforward: verify the assets, establish legal ownership, and begin the transfer process. The complexity will come afterward, when we use those assets to negotiate a permanent resolution with Whitman's organization." Detective Chen joined them, carrying additional files and looking grim. "We've received intelligence that Whitman's people intercepted yesterday's phone communications. They know about the Phoenix trip and the asset recovery plan." Marcus felt the careful structure of their plan beginning to crumble. "Does that mean it's not safe to proceed?" "It means we need to be more careful," Chen replied. "But it also means we can't delay any longer. If Whitman's organization realizes the full scope of what Mrs. Ashworth might recover, they'll take more aggressive action to prevent it." Agent Walsh spread out a map of Phoenix on the conference table. "Our plan involves multiple layers of security. We'll fly under assumed names with federal escorts. The attorney meeting will take place at a secure location rather than her office. Local FBI agents will coordinate with Phoenix police to ensure the safety deposit box access goes smoothly." Victoria studied the map, her expression growing more worried. What if something goes wrong? What if these people have contacts in Phoenix, or if the attorney isn't trustworthy? "Sarah Martinez has been vetted thoroughly," Chen assured her. "She's been practicing estate law for 23 years, with an impeccable reputation. Her firm handles numerous high-net-worth clients, and she has experience with complex asset protection cases." As for Whitman's organization, Walsh added, "they're primarily East Coast-based. They have some West Coast connections, but nothing like the infrastructure they maintain here. Phoenix should be significantly safer." Sophie, who had been listening quietly while coloring in a book Agent Walsh had provided, looked up with sudden concern. "Mommy, are you going to be in danger?" Victoria knelt beside her daughter's chair, choosing her words carefully. "Going to be very safe, because she'll have lots of people protecting her. When she comes back, things are going to be much better for both of us. Promise?" Sophie asked, with the earnestness that only children could bring to such moments. "I promise," Victoria replied. Though Marcus could see the fear in her eyes despite her confident words, the next 2 hours passed in a blur of paperwork, security briefings, and emotional preparations. Sophie was introduced to the Henderson family. Via video call, a warm couple in their 50s whose suburban home looked like something from a family magazine. Their dog Charlie performed tricks on camera, delighting Sophie and easing some of Victoria's anxiety about the temporary separation. As departure time approached, the reality of what they were attempting began to settle over everyone involved. Victoria was about to travel across the country to claim assets worth potentially tens of millions of dollars, while being pursued by criminals who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence and intimidation. Mrs. Ashworth, Agent Walsh said as they prepared to leave for the airport, I need you to understand that once we begin this process, there's no going back. If you have any doubts about proceeding, now is the time to voice them. Victoria looked around the room at the faces of people who had committed to helping her Detective Chen, K-Gen Walsh, Marcus, and the various other officials who had been working on her case. Then she looked at Sophie, who was carefully packing her stuffed rabbit in a small backpack. 18 months ago, I lost everything I thought mattered, Victoria said quietly. My husband, my home, my place in the world, my sense of who I was. But the one thing I never lost was her. If there's a chance to give her back the future she deserves, then I have to take it, regardless of the risks. The drive to the airport took place in 2 separate vehicles, Sophie riding with the Hendersons to their home. While Victoria and Marcus traveled with their federal escorts, Victoria spent the entire journey looking back through the rear window, watching until the car carrying her daughter disappeared from view. She'll be fine, Marcus said gently, understanding the torture Victoria was experiencing. Sophie is stronger than most adults I know. That's what terrifies me, Victoria replied. She shouldn't have to be strong. Should be worried about homework and playground games, not whether her mother is going to come home safely. At the airport, their federal escorts efficiently handled security procedures, bypassing normal passenger screening through TSA's specialized protocols for law enforcement travelers. Victoria and Marcus found themselves in a departure lounge reserved for government personnel, surrounded by agents whose casual alertness suggested they were prepared for trouble. Mr. Thompson, Agent Walsh said as they waited for boarding, want you to understand that your presence on this trip, while appreciated, does carry additional security considerations. You're not a trained federal agent, and if the situation becomes dangerous, you'll need to follow our instructions without question. Marcus nodded, though. He wondered what he'd gotten himself into.
Oh.
3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been paying his electric bill. He was flying to Phoenix under federal protection to help recover millions of dollars in hidden assets while being pursued by organized criminals. As their flight was called for boarding, Victoria received a text message that made her face go white. She showed the phone to Agent Walsh, who immediately signaled to her colleagues. The message was simple but chilling. Enjoy your trip to Phoenix. We'll be waiting when you get back. How did they get this number? Agent Walsh demanded. This phone was issued this morning with a completely new contact list. Detective Chen, who had been monitoring communications from the federal building, joined their conversation via encrypted phone. We've detected unusual electronic surveillance around the airport. Equipment's people have significantly more sophisticated resources than we initially assessed. Agent Walsh made rapid decisions, speaking into her radio in coded language that Marcus couldn't understand. Within minutes, their departure gate was changed, their flight was delayed, and additional security personnel appeared throughout the terminal. Are we still going? Victoria asked, her voice barely steady. We're going, Walsh confirmed. But we're changing everything about how we get there. 2 hours later, instead of boarding a commercial flight to Phoenix, Marcus and Victoria found themselves on a small federal aircraft normally used for prisoner transport. The plane was cramped and utilitarian, but it was also completely secure from surveillance and interference as they lifted off into the gathering dusk. Marcus looked down at the city lights spreading below them and thought about Sophie, probably having dinner with the Henderson family and meeting their dog Charlie. The little girl who had started this entire adventure with a simple desire for strawberry ice cream was now at the center of a federal operation that could reshape her entire future. Victoria sat across from him, staring out the small window with an expression that mixed determination with terror. In her hands, she clutched the safety deposit box key that her dead husband had left her, a small piece of metal that might hold the key to freedom or lead them deeper into danger than any of them had imagined. The plane banked west toward Arizona, carrying them toward answers that had been waiting in the desert for 18 months. Behind them, Charles Whitman was making phone calls that would ensure their return journey would be far more complicated than their departure. The race against time had begun in earnest, and the stakes had never been higher. In Phoenix, Sarah Martinez was preparing files that would reveal the true scope of Richard Ashworth's final gift to his family, the price that gift might ultimately demand from everyone trying to claim it. The federal aircraft touched down at a private airfield outside Phoenix just after midnight, its landing lights cutting through the desert darkness like searchlights. The Arizona heat hit them immediately as they disembarked to dry. Intense warmth that contrasted sharply with the humid air they'd left behind on the East Coast. Agent Rebecca Torres, Phoenix FBI coordinator, met them on the tarmac with 2 additional agents and a convoy of unmarked vehicles. She was a tall woman with graying hair, the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working cases in the Southwest. "Mrs. Ashworth," Torres said as they approached the vehicles, "we've arranged secure accommodations at a federal safe house. Sarah Martinez will meet us there at 8 a.m. The bank access has been scheduled for 10:30, after which we'll evaluate what we found and determine next steps." Victoria nodded, though exhaustion was clearly taking its toll. The stress of leaving Sophie, combined with the revelation that Whitman's organization was more sophisticated than anyone had realized, had left her looking fragile despite her determined words. Marcus found himself studying the desert landscape as they drove through the empty streets toward their destination. The stark beauty of the Southwest was unlike anything he'd experienced, vast expanses of sand and rock punctuated by the distant silhouettes of mountains that seemed to glow silver in the moonlight. The safe house turned out to be a modest ranch-style home in a quiet residential neighborhood, indistinguishable from dozens of similar houses, except for the discreet security measures that Marcus began to notice as they approached. Surveillance cameras hidden among landscape lighting, reinforced windows that looked normal but were clearly bulletproof, and what appeared to be motion sensors integrated into the garden decorations. "You'll have separate bedrooms and a common area," Agent Torres explained as she showed them inside. "There are federal marshals stationed around the perimeter, and the entire property is under electronic surveillance. You're as safe here as anywhere in the country." Despite the reassurances, Victoria spent the first hour after their arrival pacing the living room, checking her phone repeatedly for messages from Sophie or the Henderson family. Agent Walsh had established specific communication protocols brief check-ins every 4 hours to confirm everyone's safety without providing details that could be intercepted. The last message was at 8 p.m. their time, Victoria told Marcus as they sat in the sparsely furnished living room. Sophie said she was having spaghetti for dinner and that Charlie the dog knows how to shake hands. She sounded ... happy.
All right.
Heard the complex emotions in Victoria's voice, relief that Sophie was safe and apparently enjoying herself, but also a maternal sadness at missing these simple moments of her daughter's life. "She's going to have stories to tell when you get back," Marcus offered. "This might be the first really normal family experience she's had in months." Victoria smiled weakly. "You're probably right. The Henderson family seems wonderful, and Sophie has always been adaptable. Sometimes I think she handles these situations better than I do." At 8 a.m. sharp, Sarah Martinez arrived with a leather briefcase and an expression of barely contained excitement. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back, in an elegant chignon, and the kind of understated confidence that suggested decades of successful practice. "Victoria," she said, extending her hand with genuine warmth, "I've been waiting 18 months to meet you. Your husband was very specific about when and how this meeting should take place." Agent Torres had arranged for the meeting to occur in the safe house's dining room, with federal agents positioned throughout the house to ensure security. Martinez opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder sealed with multiple signatures and official stamps. "Before we discuss the financial assets," Martinez began, "I need you to understand the full scope of what Richard created for you and Sophie. Mitchell Holdings was just the beginning." She spread documents across the dining room table in corporation. Papers, property deeds, business licenses, and financial statements that painted a picture of staggering complexity and foresight. Richard Ashworth had spent 3 years before his death systematically separating legitimate assets from his criminal enterprises, creating an intricate web of legal entities designed to survive federal investigation and asset forfeiture. Real estate holdings we discussed are worth approximately $18 million. Martinez explained, pointing to property assessments from Phoenix, Denver, and Austin. But Richard also established a construction company, a property management firm, and a small chain of storage facilities across the Southwest. Victoria stared at the documents with growing amazement. How is this possible? The federal investigators were incredibly thorough, because every penny in these enterprises came from sources that predated Richard's criminal activities. Martinez replied he used inheritance money from his father, his profits from legitimate real estate deals in the 1990s, and returns on stock investments made before he started the Ponzi scheme. He was meticulous about maintaining separate financial streams. Marcus leaned forward, studying the papers with growing understanding. He was planning for this scenario from the beginning. He knew he might get caught, and he wanted to ensure Victoria and Sophie would be provided for. Exactly, Martinez confirmed. Richard was many things, but he was never stupid. He understood that his criminal activities carried enormous risks, and he spent considerable time and money protecting his family from the consequences of his choices. Agent Torres, who had been quietly observing the meeting, spoke up with concern. "What's the total value we're discussing here?" Martinez consulted her notes carefully. Conservative estimates put the combined holdings at $42 million. If the storage facility expansion projects are completed as planned, that number could reach $60 million within 2 years. The figure hung in the air like something physical, too large to fully comprehend. Victoria pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Richard had hidden for her protection. "There's something else," Martinez continued. Gently, Richard left specific instructions about how these assets should be used. He wanted the bulk of the money to establish a trust fund for Sophie's education and future needs. But he also designated funds for victim compensation. Victoria looked up sharply. Victim compensation? $10 million specifically earmarked to supplement the federal restitution fund for people defrauded by his Ponzi scheme, Martinez explained. Richard's final letter indicates he wanted to ensure that his victims received full compensation, even if it meant reducing the inheritance he left to his family. This revelation seemed to affect Victoria more deeply than the financial figures. For the first time since Richard's death, she was seeing evidence that her husband had felt genuine remorse for his crimes and had tried to make amends in the only way available to him. Would that be enough? Victoria asked quietly. To compensate everyone he hurt? Combined with the federal recovery efforts, yes, Martinez replied. Most of the original victims would receive full restitution plus interest. Some would actually recover more than they originally lost. Agent Torres was taking notes rapidly, clearly understanding the implications. Mrs. Ashworth, if you voluntarily provide victim compensation, it would eliminate most of the moral arguments that Whitman's organization uses to justify their harassment. Criminal creditors typically prey on guilt and shame without those weapons. Their position becomes much weaker. The morning passed in a blur of legal explanations, financial projections, and security considerations. By the time they prepared to leave for the bank, Victoria had signed dozens of documents establishing her legal ownership of Richard's hidden empire and authorizing the transfer of victim compensation funds. The trip to First National Bank on Elm Street took place in a carefully orchestrated convoy with federal agents and lead and follow vehicles. The bank manager, alerted to expect a federal law enforcement visit, had cleared the safety deposit box area and provided additional security personnel. The box itself, registered under Mitchell Holdings for exactly 18 months, contained items that completed the picture of Richard's elaborate planning: stock certificates, real estate deeds, insurance policies, and business contracts, called meticulously, organized and labeled for Victoria's eventual discovery. But the most significant item was a handwritten letter addressed simply to my beloved wife. Victoria read it silently in the bank's private viewing room, while federal agents maintained security outside. When she finished, tears were streaming down her face, though Marcus couldn't tell if they were tears of grief, relief, or forgiveness. He says he knew he was dying, Victoria said quietly, handing the letter to Marcus. His heart condition was worse than he let anyone know, and he was afraid he'd die before he could make things right. This was his way of trying to protect us and atone for his crimes simultaneously. Marcus read Richard's careful handwriting, noting the man's obvious intelligence and the genuine love evident in every line. Whatever crimes Richard Ashworth had committed, his final act had been one of redemption, ensuring his family's future while taking responsibility for his victims' losses as they prepared to leave the bank with copies of all relevant documents. Agent Torres received an urgent phone call that made her expression shift to high alert. "We need to return to the safe house immediately," she announced. "There's been a development back east that changes everything." The drive back was tense and silent, with additional security vehicles joining their convoy. At the safe house, Detective Chen appeared on a secure video connection with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Charles Whitman's organization made their move 3 hours ago," Chen reported. "They attempted to take Sophie into custody, claiming to be federal agents, with a court order for her protective relocation." Victoria's face went white. "Is she safe?" "She's safe," Chen assured her quickly. "The Henderson family followed protocols perfectly, and our real agents intervened before anything could happen. But Whitman's people used sophisticated fake credentials and official-looking documentation. If the Hendersons hadn't been trained to verify everything through multiple channels, the kidnapping attempt might have succeeded." The revelation that Sophie had been in immediate danger while they were recovering Richard's assets hit everyone like a physical blow. Criminals weren't just threatening future violence, they were actively attempting to use Sophie as leverage to force Victoria's compliance. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would involve significantly more danger than anyone had anticipated. "Now we use the assets Mrs. Ashworth has recovered to end this permanently, Agent," Torres replied grimly. "But first, we need to get both of you back east safely," which just became considerably more complicated. Outside the safe house windows, the Arizona desert stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, beautiful and stark under the afternoon sun. But Marcus found himself thinking about a little girl 3,000 miles away who was probably wondering why her temporary sleepover had suddenly become more serious, and a mother who was about to discover that claiming her inheritance was only the beginning of her fight for freedom. The flight back to the East Coast took place in grim silence, with federal agents coordinating constantly via encrypted communications about the deteriorating situation. Victoria spent the entire journey staring out the small aircraft window, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. Thinking about Sophie and the danger that had come so close to destroying everything they'd worked to achieve, Marcus watched. Her struggle with the helpless fury that came from being 3,000 miles away when your child was threatened. He understood that feeling, the desperate need to protect someone you loved, coupled with the terrible realization that distance made you powerless to act. "We'll get her back safely," he said quietly, though they both knew the situation had moved far beyond simple reassurance. "They tried to take her," Victoria whispered, her voice hollow with shock. "While I was claiming millions of dollars, they were trying to kidnap my daughter. What kind of mother does that make me? The kind who's trying to build a future where Sophie never has to hide again?" Marcus replied firmly. "Richard left you these assets specifically so you could protect her. Using them doesn't make you selfish, it makes you smart." Agent Torres, monitoring radio communications from the front of the aircraft, turned back to address them. "Detective Chen reports that the Henderson family performed exactly as trained. Sophie was never in real danger, and the fake federal agents were arrested before they could leave the property. She doesn't even know anything unusual happened." Victoria's relief was visible, but Marcus could see that the attempted kidnapping had fundamentally changed her perspective. The woman who had been afraid to accept help from anyone was now preparing to use every resource at her disposal to eliminate the threats against her family. They landed at the same private airfield they'd departed from 36 hours earlier, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of the rushed evacuation of their departure, this return was orchestrated like a military operation. Multiple federal agencies had coordinated to create what Agent Torres described as an overwhelming show of force designed to demonstrate that further harassment would not be tolerated. Detective Chen met them on the tarmac with news that shifted the entire dynamic of their situation. 3 hours ago, using the financial documentation you recovered in Phoenix, we executed simultaneous raids on 12 properties associated with Whitman's organization. We seized records, financial accounts, and evidence of extortion activities targeting dozens of victims beyond yourself. What about Whitman himself? Victoria asked. In federal custody, along with 6 of his associates, Chen replied with satisfaction. The attempted kidnapping gave us grounds for immediate arrest, and the evidence we recovered will support RICO charges that could put him away permanently. The news was almost too good to believe. Victoria had spent 18 months living in fear of shadows, and now those shadows had been dragged into the light and revealed to be far less powerful than they'd seemed when hidden in darkness. Can I see Sophie now? Victoria asked the question that had been consuming her thoughts for hours. She's waiting for you at the federal building, Chen confirmed, along with some very good news about how we're going to ensure this nightmare never repeats itself. The ride to the federal building took them through familiar neighborhoods that looked different, somehow less threatening, more like places where normal people lived normal lives. Marcus realized that Victoria's ordeal was fundamentally changing how both of them saw the world around them at the federal building. Sophie was sitting in Detective Chen's office, coloring pictures with federal crayons, while Agent Walsh's children, who had been brought in to provide company and normalcy, played quietly nearby. When Victoria walked through the door, Sophie's face lit up with pure joy. "Mommy," she exclaimed, running into Victoria's arms with the enthusiasm of a child who had never doubted her mother would return safely. "The Henderson family was really nice, and Charlie the dog knows 17 different tricks, and Agent Walsh's kids taught me a new card game." Victoria held her daughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling the solid reality of her small body. For several minutes they simply held each other, while the federal agents gave them space to reunite. "Did you finish the important grown-up business?" Sophie asked when they finally separated. "Yes, sweetheart," Victoria replied, smoothing Sophie's hair back from her face. "The important business is all finished, and it means we don't have to worry about complicated things anymore." Detective Chen had prepared a presentation that outlined the resolution they'd achieved. With Whitman's organization dismantled and its leadership facing federal charges, the criminal harassment would end permanently. The $10 million Richard had designated for victim compensation would be distributed through the federal restitution program, eliminating any moral claims against Victoria or her family. Most importantly, Chen explained, Mrs. Ashworth now has the financial resources to ensure her family's long-term security. The remaining $32 million, properly invested and managed, will provide income sufficient to support any lifestyle she chooses. The practical implications were staggering. Victoria could buy a house anyhow she wanted. Sophie could attend the best schools, participate in any activities that interested her, and have the kind of childhood that wealthy children took for granted. They could travel, explore opportunities, and make choices based on desire rather than desperation. But as Victoria listened to the presentations about trust funds and investment strategies, Marcus noticed she seemed more thoughtful than excited. When the formal briefings concluded and they were finally alone with Sophie, she shared what she'd been thinking. "I want to go home," she said quietly, "not to some mansion or exclusive neighborhood, but back to our apartment. Sophie likes her school. I've grown comfortable in our neighborhood, and..." She looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Some of the most important friendships we've made are there." Marcus felt his heart skip, wondering if Victoria was including him in that category. Over the past weeks, he'd grown, attached to both Victoria and Sophie in ways that went far beyond simple concern for their welfare. They'd become part of his daily life. And the thought of losing that connection as they moved into their new wealthy lifestyle was unexpectedly painful. "What about security?" Marcus asked. "Just because Whitman's people are arrested doesn't mean you're completely safe from other threats." "I've been thinking about that too," Victoria replied. Detective Chen mentioned that the federal government provides ongoing security consultation for high-profile witnesses. But more than that, I think Sophie and I need to learn to live normally again without constantly looking over our shoulders. Agent Walsh, who had been listening to their conversation, nodded approvingly. Many families in your situation choose to maintain their existing communities while upgrading their security discreetly. It's often psychologically healthier than complete relocation. Over the following weeks, Victoria began implementing changes that balanced her new financial resources with her desire for normalcy. She purchased the apartment building where they lived, renovating it into safe, affordable housing for working families, while upgrading her own unit with state-of-the-art security systems. Sophie remained at Riverside Elementary, but Victoria established a scholarship fund that improved educational resources for all the students. Marcus found his own life changing in unexpected ways. Victoria hired him as the official maintenance supervisor for her growing real estate portfolio, a position that provided steady income while allowing him to continue operating his auto repair shop. More importantly, the professional relationship gave them regular reasons to spend time together as their personal relationship continued developing. 3 months after their return from Phoenix, on a warm afternoon that reminded Marcus of the day he'd first bought Sophie ice cream, Victoria made a request that surprised him. "Would you teach Sophie about cars?" she asked as they watched Sophie play in the small park Victoria had created behind their apartment building. "I mean, really teach her not just how engines work, but how to maintain them, fix them, understand them completely." Marcus looked at Sophie, who was carefully tending a small garden she'd planted with flowers and vegetables, bringing the same methodical attention to nurturing growing things that she brought to everything she cared about. "Any particular reason?" he asked. Victoria smiled, and Marcus saw in her expression the confident woman she'd been before Richard's crimes had shattered her world. "'Cause I want her to grow up understanding that the most valuable things in life aren't things you buy there. Things you build, maintain, and share with people you care about." As if sensing their conversation was about her, Sophie looked up from her garden and waved enthusiastically. In her small hands, she held a single strawberry, the first fruit from plants she'd grown herself through patience, care, and daily attention. Marcus waved back, thinking about the strange journey that had brought them all together. It had started with loose change and a child's desire for ice cream, but it had become something much larger, a story about second chances, unexpected friendships, and the ways that simple kindness could grow into something that changed everyone involved. That evening, as Marcus closed his shop and prepared to join Victoria and Sophie for dinner, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. He reflected on how much his life had changed since that first afternoon when a little girl had counted her coins on his workbench. He'd gained a family he'd never expected, work that provided both purpose and financial security, and most surprisingly, love that had grown gradually from friendship and shared challenges. Sophie had her mother back, her mother had her freedom back. Both of them had a future filled with possibilities rather than limitations. The strawberry ice cream that had started everything was just a memory now, but the sweetness it had led to would last for years to come. In a world where small kindnesses often went unnoticed, theirs had bloomed into something extraordinary, proof that caring for others, even in the smallest ways, could create ripples that eventually transformed everything they touched. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Let's click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.